welcome to episode number 299 of the Armin Show podcast, where it is always interesting with science and professors, learning more and connecting with one another. On this episode, close to 300, we have Professor Elizabeth S. Anderson. She is a professor at University of Michigan. Arthur F. Thurnau Professor and John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies at that university, and specializes in political philosophy, ethics, and feminist philosophy, which is wonderful. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I am glad to have you on. And before we get into the topics and your book and other work, I always like to mention backstory. And past guest Yancey Strickler, co-founder of Kickstarter, had mentioned that you were one of the very few people that inspires him, or your work connects with his ethos. And I thought that was wonderful. And he is a very warm individual. And so I always like to check upon individuals that are recommended or the basis of someone's thinking. And I like warmth a lot. So that was good. And you know of Yancey as well. In fact, how do you know of him in the first place too?
So back in the day, a couple of years ago, I was chair of the philosophy department at University of Michigan. And Yancey came to my attention. I can't recall exactly how, but I wanted to invite him to speak to our philosophy, politics, and economics majors. It's an undergraduate program that I created a few years ago. And I thought he would be really ideal for inspiring the undergraduates and giving them a vision of what enterprise can do.
Enterprise is the topic I believe we will be covering. Did you guys speak in any form about your viewpoints or shared viewpoints of the sort?
You know, we've talked a little bit about that, and also about like better ways to live.
Right. That is a key thing. How can we live in a smoother way than we did 10 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, with a little bit more knowledge in our thoughts? Now, that is wonderful, and the connections of life. How did you get to your current position as a professor where you are? How did you get to this point from where you started? Why philosophy? Why not accounting?
Well, you know, that's really a great question. So I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore College right outside of Philadelphia. I was originally interested in majoring in economics. That was my big thing. I was a real fan of economics. But as I was studying economics, it just raised some philosophical questions for me. Like in economics, they use this term preference, and people are always supposed to be maximizing the satisfaction of their preferences, and that's supposed to make them happier, they'll be better off. But I had a lot of questions about that, because a lot of times people in pursuing their preferences do stuff that isn't all that great for them. You know, like you might get addicted to drugs, and you even as you're seeking the next high, you know that it's actually not making you better off, right?
Right.
You just get trapped. And there's just and it's not just that, but people do a lot of stuff that they come to regret, and that even as they're doing it, they take the extra piece of cake and they know they're going to gain weight, all this kind of stuff, right? And I was thinking, economics isn't really helping us understand when the satisfaction or pursuit of our preferences would be good or not, but it's in philosophy where we explore those issues, and also explore issues about the organization of society and whether it's just or not, or, you know, whether it helps people. And economics was taking certain things for granted, certain assumptions for granted that I thought needed to be explored and investigated. And that's really what led me into philosophy and majoring in philosophy, but I'm still a very heavy consumer of economics, and a lot of my work intersects with economics and is about how we organize work and production and markets and exchange.
Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like economics didn't have some of the elements that you most resonate with that philosophy is able to tackle.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Yeah, I think that's what differentiates different fields. It's like you would not go into one field because it's like, I'm not drawn, you're not touching on these key points that matter to me. And so you'd switch to a different category. That's pretty cool. Now, in philosophy, which subcategories have you delved into most, and who are some of the people behind, or they have views that you go with or have read from and based your thoughts on?
Yeah. So let me just start by telling you what for me was by far the most influential course I ever took in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It was a course taught by a wonderful philosopher of science, Hugh Lacey, at Swarthmore College when I was an undergraduate. I took this course on the history and philosophy of science. And we studied the history of astronomy and physics from the ancient Greeks to about Newton, okay? And there was a scientific revolution that took place with Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, people like that. And then there was a lot of philosophical discussion that was happening about, well, what really, the whole foundation of physics and astronomy was completely overturned during this revolution. And philosophers in the 17th and 18th century were all trying to figure out how that happened and why. And how do we know that this is a better way to do science? And so questions about knowledge and questions about metaphysics, like, do colors really exist, or are they just subjective features of our mind that processes, physical attributes in these subjective ways? And once I study the history of science, suddenly the history of early modern metaphysics and epistemology started making sense in a way they had never done before. And that gave me this amazing idea. When you look at philosophers of science, what they're doing is they're tackling metaphysical and epistemological issues that arise within the practice of science itself. That is, questions that arise outside of philosophy, in the practice of other forms of inquiry, were the things that these early modern philosophers were trying to answer. And I thought, how come we don't do ethics that way, right? In ethics, so much of it is foundational. You try to come up just by thinking hard with some foundational principle of ethics, like utilitarianism. Oh, we should just maximize happiness, right? Or the categorical imperative. We should only act on, principles that we could universalize, that everybody could act on at the same time. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then you try to figure out what to do on the basis of these very abstract and general principles. And I was thinking, well, the philosophers of science don't think that we can come up with principles of science independent of actual empirical investigation that scientists are doing. So why should we think that we can come up with fundamental principles of ethics without looking at the actual ethical problems that people confront in their actual lives, and how that changes historically as we have to meet new challenges? And it's really this inspiration to take how philosophers of science work today, where they look at metaphysical and epistemological questions that are arising in the actual practice of science. Like, do fundamental particles really exist, or are they just waves or features of fields, right? That's sort of a metaphysical question. Or how do we even know whether, the laws we're coming up with to describe, physical events are true? and right, they're taking problems from some other domain of practice, mm-hmm. And then philosophers are trying to like figure out answers. And I thought, well, we should be doing that in moral and political philosophy too. We should be looking at the problems that arise, say, in political organization, in work, in production, or just in ordinary life when individuals are coming to grips with hard choices in their life, and start thinking from those problems. And then philosophers can help clarify the questions. They can help, drawing distinctions that maybe will forge a path forward for exploring possible answers. We can help ourselves understand how to test hypotheses about how to live. And that's really where I'm coming from. And the great inspiration here turns out to be John Dewey, the great pragmatist philosopher. And I'm, Dewey all the way down. I'm a pragmatist.
Long support for the Dewey Decimal System. That's pretty good. One thing that comes to mind based on what you were saying, how important are questions? How much value is there in questions when you come up with questions on a topic? Is there a lot of answer in a question? I was thinking about this recently.
Oh, that's like such a deep question. And in fact, that gets right to the heart of pragmatism.
Oh.
So Dewey thought that suppose in the course of life, you face a circumstance in which you can't proceed as normal, as usual, just according to habit. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so that now you have to stop and deliberate about what to do. Okay. So just to give you a very simple example, suppose you always take a certain path to work that cuts through a forest and down a ravine, and you would always cross a little bridge right at that time. But suppose this time on your way to work, the bridge has fallen down. Okay, what do you do now, right? And that's when you, instead of like just walking mindlessly by habit, you can't do that anymore. Now the world has thrown up an obstacle and you got to figure out, well, I mean, do I have to find a different route? Should I call ahead and, explain why I can't get to work on time? Should I try to see if I could, climb down the ravine and back up, but maybe it's like too muddy or slippery or something, or too steep. Mm-hmm. Maybe I can find a log, right, and push it across and then like climb along the log, like, right? I have to explore different options, right?
Yes.
And what Dewey said is that once, you have an open-ended problem that you haven't precisely specified, but once you specify the question precisely enough, the answer is in your lap. Right? That is, my problem is finding a way to get across. I've narrowed it down, maybe because I don't see another way around it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And hence my problem, maybe I can narrow it down, is finding a fallen log big enough that will hold my weight and is big enough to cross the entire ravine. You see what I mean?
Right.
And you get it, you specify your problem in greater and greater detail until the complete solution is already contained in your description of the problem. Mm-hmm. And so asking the right question in a way is the path to finding the solution.
That makes sense. Yeah, I've had that feeling. Also, that's a good point about it. Suddenly when you're kicked off of autopilot, you can't be on autopilot, and suddenly it's time to think, time to use the prefrontal cortex again.
Yeah, exactly. Because most of the time we are just creatures of habit.
There's a lot of that.
We're just on autopilot most of the time, mm-hmm. Because we have limited cognitive resources. So we can't be deliberating about everything. And Dewey stressed, and we know this is true, that in fact, performance gets worse usually if you're thinking too hard about it. Like if you're an athlete you just want to be in the zone, right? You don't want to have to be deliberating, how do I swing the bat? No, you just got to be in the zone and you just feel it, right? And you do it right.
Like it's in your subconscious and not in your conscious.
Yeah.
Already there.
Yeah.
That's a great point. There's a couple of great life points actually that we're bringing up, which is good. I remember I read about that as far as sports players. You want to get to the point where you're not processing, or if you are, the quality of your ability goes down. They're not supposed to.
Yeah, exactly. And so what's going on here, it's super important, is that, of course, the baseball player, the batter, has to be attuned to very fine, features of the environment, how fast the ball's coming, what curve it's coming in at, and so forth. They have to be attuned to that, but they shouldn't be thinking consciously about it. It's like all of their reflexes and their perception has to be keyed into that, but you actually don't want conscious cognition intervening because that's slow and stupid. And so what's beautiful about this is that it takes like hours and hours of practice, but what you're practicing at is not some mechanical motion that's repeated exactly the same. No, what actually you're practicing at is getting that attunement between your body and the rapidly changing environment so that your bat can hit the ball in just the right place at just the right velocity and direction and so forth to, bat the ball where you want it to go.
Right.
And so habits then become a matter of attunement and responsiveness to a pretty fine-grained variations in the environment. And that's why we shouldn't think of habit as these mechanical, stupid things where we're just like, a machine that's just repeating the identical motion over and over again. Habits are not like that. They're actually subtle and responsive. When they're good, when they're really finely tuned, that's what they're doing. They're very skilled.
Right. Oh, speaking on the point of responsiveness, what are your thoughts on the idea that level of responsiveness is associated with intelligence? How would those be connected?
Oh, I agree, but we have to understand intelligence very expansively and not in this reductive way that you could measure with an IQ test or any other kind of test, right? I mean, there's physical intelligence, right? And that's something you don't, paper and pencil tests are not going to measure that. And there's also, like, for other kinds of habits, emotional intelligence, right? I mean, if you say are in a job where you have to interact with other people, you need some emotional intelligence to sort of pick up on, maybe something's making your coworker upset or whatever, or anxious, right? You got to be attuned to that and think, or students, like I teach, and so I have to be attuned to when students are confused or anxious about something and help move them to, greater self-confidence in their intellectual abilities and in the way they do philosophy and things like that.
One thing I like when you're describing the story, well, two things come to mind, but the story you were describing earlier, the level of detail you brought to it as far as not having to go on the same regular path, it came to mind that I feel like the individual who takes something to full description or story or makes the question in full form will get much further in life than the person who goes like 20% and then kind of says, and you get it, or kind of just shortens it at that point and doesn't describe it in full detail, because I feel like they do that everywhere they go. Have you ever thought about this concept of people kind of doing everything the same way, whatever it is, driving on the freeway or the way they take a test or the way they send an email? They're all kind of, they have a similar how far they take something before they're like, that's good enough, I'm not going to put more effort in.
Yeah, so yeah, there definitely are people like that. I mean, you can also, I have to say, get a little too obsessive and too perfectionist. Sometimes you just gotta like get the work out and right,
Right.
not have to polish it to the finest degree.
Right. That's true. And then on the other point, as far as intelligence, you mentioned emotional and physical, and then the like IQ kind. What kinds of intelligence appear to be more relevant in today's age versus maybe, I don't know, 100 years ago?
You know, I think all of these forms of intelligence remain relevant, but perhaps in different domains. So what we do find is that in the world of work,
Mhm.
sheer manual skill is being replaced by robots, you know, machine, sophisticated manufacturing, right? And so perhaps that's getting displaced to a certain degree, but we still have physical skill in more craft-like jobs. Like if you're a plumber, right? You just got to be there, or you know what I mean, or a carpenter who's actually like directly working on repairs or construction. That there's still a lot of scope for skilled manual labor in those places, but in manufacturing, where you're just making millions of the same item, that tends to be automated more and more.
Right. That's true. Emotional intelligence appears to be well received at the current time.
Well, you know, but this is a problem. So it's one of the things I'm working on right now. It's kind of a sequel to my book, Private Government: How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. I'm writing a book about the work ethic and the history of the work ethic from the mid 17th century to the present, with a special focus on the Industrial Revolution. Because what happened there was that you had manufacturing became mechanized during the Industrial Revolution. It was converted from craft labor to mechanized labor. And what we're seeing today is the attempt to turn more domains of work, including forms of work that have traditionally involved a lot of emotional engagement with other people, into a more mechanized, repetitive, rule-driven kind of work. So you can see this especially in medicine. My husband is a primary care physician, so he's feeling the brunt of this. So if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, there were all these critics of mechanized factory labor because it was de-skilling and boring and repetitive and grueling and like horrible, right? Right. You originally, you know, if you were a master of a craft, you would create the whole object, whatever it might be, right? A shoe, or, you know, a piece of furniture or something, right? And then with mechanization, now you're only confined to one simple repetitive motion. So Adam Smith, famously in The Wealth of Nations, discusses a pin factory where a worker who previously fashioned an entire pin now was just reduced to putting the head on the pin or just pointing the tip of the pin, and they did that 1 million times a day. Right? It's like repetitive and boring, and they've lost a lot of skill, right? And the thing is that drive to automate and mechanize and de-skill and reduce to a set of fixed rules has now invaded the professions. You see this in teaching, especially at the K through 12 level. You have these charter schools that are based on fixed curricula and literally spell out every single word that the teacher utters. And every single thing, everything is precisely scripted. There's no room for deviation. Everything is on a rigid schedule. The students themselves have scripted responses that they have to repeat. Everything's turned into automation, right? And totally rule driven. There's no autonomy. There's no independent thinking. And what happens in those kinds of schools, it is true, and I will grant that those schools enable children to get very high test scores. Okay, but what's eliminated, right, is all this other stuff that you want education to do, which has to do with, you want kids to be able to say, present their ideas before others and learn how to think for themselves and stand up for themselves and work as a team and cooperate and play well together and all these other things, which are kind of eliminated in the steamroll obsession of getting high test scores. And the same thing is happening in medicine, where again, they speed up the assembly line, and now you got to see one patient every 15 minutes. So there's no room in the frenetic pace and all the roles. They have checklists of things you have to check up on now. Okay, well, how much time is left to actually deal with the problem that the patient has come in that they're worried about? And how can you deal with the fact that their problem isn't just a purely physiological thing, but it's also a form of suffering, that they're very worried maybe that this is cancer, right? And then you have to probe their worries and how are they going to cope, or maybe say, oh, this isn't cancer, this is just a minor thing. Right. I mean, there's all this emotional work that has to be done with effective medicine, patient care, that gets eliminated because there's no time for that anymore. Nope, gotta go on to the next patient. So you just write a prescription on your pad. Right, it's there's no time for dealing with the fact that people are worried, and there's all these coping skills maybe that they need, and no time for that, right? Because you got to go on to the next, and medicine gets reduced too. So you see that drive to mechanization that was started in manufacturing, and it's de-skilling the professions now and cutting out what makes them meaningful for people.
Right. When you're describing that, it makes me think of sometimes a conversation with a person where if they are too much talking about formalities, well, then you'll talk about formality, then maybe you'll eat something and they'll talk about formality, some general thing. You never got to something like your deep well-being for each of you. And then the time is up.
That's right. And, and there is this idea that if somebody comes in with a medical problem, there's a cookie cutter solution, but usually not. There's all kinds of psychosocial factors that are peculiar to that individual, their personality, their way of relating to medical care, and to maybe the deterioration of their bodies as they age, right? Everybody's got a different story. You need time to kind of work with people so that they can figure out how to cope in a way that's compatible with their personality and with the relationships they have with other people who might help or maybe not be so helpful with that to them. Right.
This brings up the point that comes to mind for me that's very important, is nuance. I've talked about this a few times, how it seems like the highest value, a very high value item we have in society is nuance and detail-oriented nature, and actually looking at the real issue versus maybe in the work industry, it has its own response, or the medical industry has its own baseline response that doesn't get to the more important issues, but it works generally. And I talked with that with ethicist Susan Lioto, who works on ethics, and we talked a lot about nuance in terms of service and paperwork and how important it is for the consumer to also be on the same point. How much do you think about nuance or detail-oriented nature being the actual solution to a lot of issues that can't be solved by some cookie cutter method?
Oh, I agree completely. But here's the critical point. You need to leave room, for the articulation of that nuance, right? And that's what's getting, I think, driven out of a lot of work these days, right?
Space.
You tend to reduce everything to just a set of protocols. It's a big problem for people.
At this one company my friend was at, they were called standard operating procedures. They had a bunch of these SOPs and they would follow.
Yeah, Exactly. Yeah, sometimes standard doesn't work that well.
Right. Sometimes it's not the thing. Speaking of that, related to that book, Private Government: How Employers Rule Our Lives, your previous book, what is an impact that employers are having on people's lives in 2021 that is heavily impacting them, but nobody's talking about it?
There's a lot of issues, but a big problem that I see is that the scope of the employer's authority extends well past the workplace. Most workers have no idea until they're slammed with it that the work that their job is in jeopardy, even for stuff they do when off duty, just because their boss might not like it. Okay, and my view is it's none of the boss's business, who you're sleeping with or what kind of recreation you have on the weekends. If you want to smoke a joint on the weekend, like, it's really not your boss's business. And no, I mean, if you show up stoned on Monday, can't perform, okay, now then your boss has a legitimate complaint.
What are you doing?
But if you're up there sober on Monday and can do the work, it's really none of your boss's business what your recreational activities were over the weekend. But in reality, under the law, you can be fired by your employer because they don't like your off-duty lifestyle. And I think that's just wrong. It's really none of their businesses. Workers need the right to lead their lives independent of their employer's judgment, and not empower the employer to start messing with them because, they said something on Facebook that their employer disagrees with, or, they have a sexual partner that their employer doesn't approve of. It's really none of their business, right? But employment law doesn't protect workers from that. And most workers have no idea that they could be fired for stuff like that.
Does it also to extend to, I was thinking like how I know somebody who their employer kind of has them do more work outside of work to keep up, even though it's not required. But if they didn't do an extra certain amount outside of their work, they'd be behind the next day.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another way in which employers tyrannize over us. And I want to point out, American workers have no idea how bad American workers have it compared to workers in other rich countries, especially in Europe. If you go to Denmark, every worker gets 5 weeks of paid vacation, plus like a zillion holidays. It's unbelievable how much leisure they have. And it's forbidden for the employer to just send them work over the weekend and expect them to do it. It's same in France. Many, many weeks of guaranteed paid vacation, and the boss can't hassle you after work or over the weekends to do more. They're like even forbidden to send you emails during those times, right? And they're not allowed to like monitor whether you're working. In Denmark, they forbid you even from voluntarily logging on to your work email. Like, it's not okay. No, you're supposed to be at leisure. And here in America, nowhere are workers guaranteed paid vacation by law. You might have it under your work contract. About half of American workers do get paid vacation under their labor contract, which of course could be is subject to change depending on the bargaining power of the worker. But even of those workers who have paid vacation as part of their contract, about half of all American workers don't even take all the vacation they're entitled to, precisely because they're worried that if they're not showing up at the office, right, and working like crazy, they're going to get fired, or they won't get a promotion, and so forth. And so American workers are on this incredible treadmill and can't get off because there's no leisure. And they're at risk of losing their positions if they don't like put in double overtime and stuff. It's crazy.
Right. That's a good point about the treadmill, actually. I was kind of feeling that about society in general up until this hefty virus, that it was the treadmill was like at like 12, like a 12 miles per hour. And so this was almost like a breather for the nation. But you're right, if the system's a little bit off, it'll probably return to that. There was a recent top 10 countries happiest in the world, and Denmark was in there, and Finland and Iceland. And it makes sense that when you were describing that, it made me think, do you know Cal Newport's book, Deep Work? Or have you heard of that? Or it's
No,
like
I don't know that.
it's like if basically distractions completely destroy you. And so deep work is like 2 hours, 3 hours of focus time. And the same thing with, let's say, work there. If you have emails coming in at night, and it's like a continuous treadmill thing where you never actually replenish in some form.
Oh yeah, right. And also there's way too much interruption and distraction. You know, for my kind of work, when I'm writing, I can't have distraction. I just got to be focused, right? No interruption. and like, when do workers get that?
Right. What is actually, on that point, what is a counter force to that? Is there one for, like, let's say the United States? Is there some counter to that treadmill?
Well, if only. I do think that we need to seriously revive the labor movement. And to a certain degree, it's starting to happen. But workers are under a serious disadvantage when it comes to things like opportunities to unionize. And a lot of that is because labor law is no longer enforced. It is illegal to fire a worker for participating in union organization, but it happens all the time, routinely. Mm-hmm. It's the norm, even though it's illegal. And there's no effective enforcement. Judges are stacked against labor. And so employers pretty much have impunity to do whatever they want. We'll see what happens, because now there's an Amazon union drive at an Amazon warehouse in Alabama. We'll see if that succeeds. I think they're voting right now, or very soon, at any rate. We'll see. But Amazon has, intimidated people, fired people, threatened them, even though that's illegal too, by the way. It's illegal to threaten people that their jobs will be lost if they vote for a union, but it's still absolutely routine to do that.
Well, so if Denmark appears to have a more well-off system, would they have at one point in the long past kind of been like some parts of what we have, or did they start off on a different direction and remain that way? Do they have like unions, or how does it work?
Yeah, so this is like the incredible thing, is that the United States used to be, Europeans would look at the United States and think, this is a worker utopia, at least for white men, right? We're not talking about slaves or women, right? But Europeans would look at the circumstances of white men, like in the 19th century, and they thought this is like a worker's utopia, mm-hmm. right? They had high wages, they had much higher levels of education, far better opportunities, huge opportunities to get your own land. They had the Homestead Acts. You just go west, you get some free land. Now, let's keep in mind, of course, that's because it was all grabbed very violently from Native Americans. So I'm not going to like praise everything that the Europeans were praising about it, but they did say this incredible land of opportunity for white men, at least. And, for generations, American workers, free workers, were much better off than European workers. Oh. But what happened in the post-war era was the rise of social democracy in Europe, and certainly in the Scandinavian countries. And ultimately, social democracy delivered far better results for workers than anything the United States came up with. And so that's why, workers in Denmark and Sweden, Norway, and so forth, right, are just way better off. And not only there, but even in Germany and France, they're generally better off. Part of it's due to higher rates. It's not so much higher rates of unionization, but the unions have much greater bargaining power. They have things like sectoral bargaining, where the unions can bargain on behalf of all the workers in a whole sector of industry. And they have these grand bargains, between like conglomerations of employers and very large sectors of workers. And they just hammer everything out. But the other thing that's very important to the social democratic model, it was invented in Germany, but it spread. It's known as co-determination. And co-determination means that workers have a voice in management. They sit on the board of directors of the firm where they're employed, but they also participate in what's known as works councils, which regulate the day-to-day operations, like how work goes on the factory floor or just in the office on the day-to-day, what work conditions are like, what the pace is like, what kinds of surveillance of workers is okay and what isn't, and so forth. Like all the details of what makes your workday go better or worse are not just exclusively dictated by the employer, but workers have a genuine voice in that, and that gives them dignity and respect, as well as some kind of standing where their interests are taken into account.
A good point that just came up as you were describing that, it almost sounds like the average communication per capita in Denmark is higher than national communication or expression per capita in the United States. Like there's a good chunk of people that are, let's say, silenced in a way.
Oh yeah, I think that's right, because look, we could see this in the pandemic. Early on, when there was a shortage of personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, you had nurses and doctors complaining to the press, or maybe just on social media, that they didn't have enough masks and gloves and gowns and so forth. And then they would be fired for making those complaints. This is shocking and outrageous. And let's keep in mind that it is illegal in the United States under labor law to fire a worker for complaining about conditions. But if there's one thing that we know is that labor law is not enforced, and workers don't really have any serious recourse against the grossest violations of their rights, because judges don't care, because a pile of precedents very unfavorable to workers has piled up, and because many of them they work under mandatory arbitration, which means that if they have a complaint, they don't get the chance to have it heard by a court. In fact, it's heard secretly by some private arbitrator who knows that if they don't render decisions mostly in favor of the employer, they won't get their contract renewed. So you can guess how much less favorable mandatory arbitration is to workers than decisions rendered in the federal courts.
Well, so if the same issue happened and it was in Denmark and the United States, the Danish person would have more of a support from.
Oh, they'd have, look, first of all, they'd be typically backed up by a union, so they can't be fired because it's a real serious union. They have a works council. They can direct their complaint through a works council, right? There's all kinds of internal ways of adjudicating, instead of the boss just saying, I don't really care, I don't have to pay attention to you. No, they would have to pay attention, because the work council is staffed half by employees who have an interest in paying attention and taking care, right? It's not just the boss deciding whether or not they're interested in hearing this complaint. They have to hear, because otherwise, the workers can force the issue, since they're part of management too.
That makes sense. It's like built into the system as part of it.
Correct. Yes.
One other related concept is there are more socially democratic there And as the world is becoming more connected, like we have the last 10, 15 years have brought almost all the countries on the planet to the table of internet connection and trade more so, I believe. Does that make the countries that are not as social or collectivist have a disadvantage versus the ones that are more group oriented?
Well, I think under the current rules of international trade, they've kind of been rigged in the interest of capitalists to give certain kinds of trading advantages to the dog-eat-dog countries. Right, where all the competition among workers drives wages and labor conditions down to the rock bottom. You don't want to be a factory worker in like Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's not so hot.
Right.
Right, because it's all dog-eat-dog competition. But we could change the rules of international trade. Like, these were built by human beings, and we could change the rules in order to ratchet up labor standards so that workers in poor countries could get a better deal. And it wouldn't even cost consumers in rich countries that much. I just want to stress this. Like, they even tested this out some while ago, and I can't remember, but maybe like in El Salvador, there's some shirt factory, okay, that's making shirt for consumption. It's being bought by the big brand name fashion firms for consumption in the United States. Mm-hmm. You could double the wages of like a textile worker or a sewer in El Salvador, and the price that you would face in the United States for the shirt maybe goes up like a quarter, 25%. I mean, I'm sorry, 25 cents, yeah. Not 25%, right. 25 cents. It's like you wouldn't even notice. Right. It's so small. It just shows you how little the price of the stuff we buy goes to workers in the first place. It goes to the brand. It goes to the marketing people. It's not actually going to the people who make this stuff.
Right.
But you can double their wages. I mean, they'd be like vastly better off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And rich consumers wouldn't even notice the difference.
Right. I've thought about this concept in life, such as like when things are good for a group, it doesn't take much to have an impact on those who have not had it good, because you already have a base of good. So you're comfortable. I don't know how to exactly verbalize it, but there's real opportunity. Kind of like Barack Obama one time, he said, if you're in a position of opportunity, if you don't reach back and bring somebody with you, you shouldn't really be there, because
I agree.
You have so much potential right there.
Yeah. I mean, economists talk about the declining marginal utility of money, right? So if you have $1 million, an extra dollar doesn't make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're living on $2 a day, an extra dollar makes a gigantic difference, right? So, right, it could make the difference between living and dying, where it's not going to make any really no noticeable difference at all to somebody who has $1 million. So, right, it's just pretty easy to figure out that at very little cost to oneself, channeling more money to people who are much less well off is an obvious winner.
Mm-hmm. I've thought about this in terms of like energy. Let's say I'm having a day where I'm packed with energy and full of radiance. I could make 10 people's days better that are not doing great with little things, because I have the surplus. It's kind of like the same.
Yeah. I mean, a little thing for you might actually make a big difference to somebody else. Yeah.
I always relate things back to people in relationships when I take it from different categories, but I always go back to people in relationships. It's nice to see how the world is progressing. Where are you seeing, what issues are you seeing being relevant in this decade of the 2020s for us to think about so we can get along as people?
Well, I think there's several big issues, right? One of it is the state of democracy. It's pretty frayed, and a lot of it has to do with the toxic discourse of politics. So in my state, the state of Michigan, you might have heard that the co-chair of the Republican Party referred to the governor, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General of Michigan, all three women, as three witches who need to be burned at the stake. And then he talked about us, not him personally, but like the possibility that the two Republican members of the House of Representatives who voted to impeach Donald Trump the second time around might be assassinated. Okay, like this is very violent rhetoric, right? I mean, like really, and the co-chair of the state Republican Party is talking like this. Like that's very anti-democratic. So I think a big issue for the next decade is restoring a democratic ethos of communication where we don't treat the political opposition as like enemies of the people who need to be destroyed. Okay, just drop the violence, see that everybody's a human being here, that in fact, within a democracy, there's enormous potential to build policies from which everyone can gain. Stop seeing politics as this sort of realm in which people are just trying to insult and troll each other and, get people upset and act superior. Right? That's not what politics is for, right? We're supposed to be communicating with each other so that we can get a handle on what are the problems that we face together and come up with solutions, cooperative solutions for solving the problems that we face together. Things like the pandemic, like climate change, right?
Bigger picture.
And I do think that maybe President Biden is helping us talk in more constructive ways. He talks in more constructive ways. He's not paying attention to all the backstabbing and trolling and insults and all the nastiness. He just is ignoring all that. He's always only addressing the American people, not the chattering politicians or people yakking on social media and being mean to each other. He's showing empathy for everybody. He's recognizing the costs that everyone has borne with the pandemic, right? And he's thinking carefully about working with Congress, coming up with solutions to help people. And I think people are hearing that and they're coming to recognize, maybe government can work for everybody. And that's what I think the pandemic bill, the relief bill was all about. We can make government work for everybody. That's a profound message, and to experience that in our lives maybe will help us get off the acrimony and divisiveness and start serious cooperation. And that's something that I think all the democracies have to learn, because democracy is fraying at the edges in a lot of countries, not just the United States.
Mm-hmm. I once talked with Peter Coleman from Columbia, and his book was about polarization and reducing it in some form because it doesn't tend to be helpful.
It's totally not helpful. Look, it's not, if you interpret what anybody says as a move in a game of positioning who's better than who's morally superior or whatever, that's a catastrophe, because that's a zero-sum game where one person can rise or your group can rise only at the expense of some other group that's put down. It's toxic, it's destructive, and it's totally not real. because you're just engaging in this symbolic positioning rather than actually dealing with real problems that we face, which are serious. We have climate change, we have the pandemic, people die, right, from these things, right? These are real problems, and we got to get to the real problems. And that means we have to set aside all of this kind of jockeying for status by insulting each other.
Makes me think of a baseline example, like on the freeway, somebody cut somebody off and there was like a race and they cut them off and I won. And then like a minute later, they're on their path and they're like, oh, what was that? I don't know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, what? I mean, this is not a racetrack.
Right.
Why are you thinking of it that way?
Right. It's very short.
Why not just like drive safely, okay? Because, each of us has our own destinations to reach.
There's some cool stuff over there, maybe.
Yeah.
Point. It's kind of funny. One thing I like to check is, do you have any people, like one or two, that you would recommend I would speak with, or that comes to mind as far as people that you think would be interesting to talk with, if anybody comes to mind? From the greater
you
world.
Talk to my colleague, Peter Railton.
Peter Railton?
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
How do you know of Peter?
Well, Peter's my colleague in the philosophy department, but he's also, I think, he's very deeply engaged in thinking about the emotions and emotional attunement and how that helps us navigate, through our environments successfully. So I really, and he's very deep into the psychological research on this.
Oh.
So I think you'd enjoy talking to him.
That sounds wonderful. And then I'll check with Peter. And then one last question is, if you had a megaphone to all people of the planet, what is the message you would want to tell them about one of the topics we have covered, or something you are currently working on that might help them in their mindset?
I would say human beings work better together when we cooperate on terms of mutual respect and equality. And that requires always looking for win-win propositions rather than jockeying for a superior advantage over others.
That is a clear and great message right there. Professor Anderson, I would like to thank you for having been on this episode of The Armin Show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Glad to, and we are out.